Bohemia, CIA, 1970s. As MIT historian Professor David Kaiser described in his book, How the Hippies Saved Physics, and in the Nova PBS Einstein's Riddle, the Central Intelligence Agency in the early 1970s recruited me and other fringe, hippie, bohemian, eccentric, but credentialed with PhDs from top universities like Fritjof Capra, Nick Herbert, me, others, Fred Allen Wolf, to work on two problems. By the way, I was never a hippie. Nick Herbert, you might say, he qualifies kind of as a hippie. And to some extent Saul Paul Sarag, but I was never a hippie. I was definitely more what Herbert Gold described as a bohemian. Also, even in the sense of the Bohemian Club in San Francisco, Bohemian Grove. Although I'm not a member of the Bohemian Club, I have been to the Grove many times as a guest of prominent member of the club. So Bohemians are not the same as hippies. Bohemians, we like money, we like fast cars, we like aristocratic women, and etc. So we're not at all hippies. We do not in other words, we're capitalists. We're not communists like the hippies. Okay, all right. Continue. So the two problems that the CIA wanted us to work on was, how does consciousness emerge from matter, including the paranormal, the UFO high strangeness, in a good paper by Eric Davis and Jacques Vallée, and also remote viewing. That's the CIA project in the 70s, to which I briefly was associated at the Stanford Research Institute with Hal Puthoff, Russell Targ, and Pat Price, Uri Geller, Ingo Swann, very important. And the second problem, which is more relevant to today's APEC meeting, how do the flying saucers fly? Now, I claim, ladies and gentlemen, to have completely solved qualitatively, conceptually, both of these problems, in the sense that the physics explaining them is mainstream and actually relatively elementary, including, in fact, indeed obvious, once one has the correct general idea that has been hidden in plain sight. Eric Weinstein claims that this physics that I'm talking about was hidden by the U.S. deep state in the early 1950s for reasons of national security. I support Weinstein's general allegation here. In fact, my Cornell professors from the late 1950s, who basically ran the Manhattan Project for Oppenheimer, some of them were at those meetings and were obviously involved. Eric Weinstein has alleged that advanced physics, particularly related to gravitation, anti-gravity, was intentionally suppressed by the U.S. government starting in the 1950s. Yeah, well, that's because, first you have to go back to Magenta, at least 1933 in northern Italy, I guess near the Austrian border. Mussolini's people, Marconi was in charge of that, kind of the first Italian Roswell. Marconi was a close friend of my grandfather's distant cousin, Margherita Sarfatti, who, of course, was very close to Benito Mussolini. So I know a little bit about that. And then I know that the CIA was partly created in 1947 because of Roswell and other things. I have a lot of information about that, but I can't. It's not the place to get into those details. And So Eric claims center on the idea that this research, which he believes was part of a golden age of general relativity, was diverted into classified channels for reasons of national security. The evidence for this claim, however, is not substantiated in the mainstream physics community. The key allegations: the Chapel Hill Conference, 1957. Let's see, in 1957, I was already I was I entered Cornell in September of 1956. So in the spring of 1957, I was still a freshman physics, math, philosophy major at Cornell. And so Weinstein asserts that this academic conference on gravitation was a covert effort by the government to explore anti-gravity and field physics. There is some evidence for that because I was pretty close to Philip Morrison, professor of physics at Cornell at that time. And of course, this is when Morrison, with Cocconi, began to work on the paper on the 21 centimeter hydrogen line as a way of contacting extraterrestrials. So they were definitely into that, although I don't remember any of my professors explicitly talking about anything like Roswell or flying saucers. But, all right, connections to intelligence. Weinstein points out the involvement of organizations and individuals with military and intelligence connections, suggesting they act as cutouts to fund and control the research. Yeah, that's definitely true because they did that to me, years later. I mean, very, very explicitly. I mean, basically, I've been funded by them for many years in different ways. And now, alternative physics. Weinstein speculates that this hidden research progressed in secrecy, and etc. Okay, well, that's sort of a main topic which I know a lot about because of my direct involvement, and it's something we can discuss. Okay, let's get to the physics now. And we start with Einstein's 1905 classical theory of space-time, special relativity. Einstein published his special theory of relativity in 1905 before quantum mechanics in its modern form was created in the mid-1920s to early 1930s, primarily by Heisenberg, Schrödinger, de Broglie, Born, and Dirac. The special theory of relativity is really only a vacuum theory. A lot of physicists and physics teachers do not properly understand this. Einstein was concerned with how Alice and Bob, each in what are called special inertial frames of reference, see moving meter sticks and clocks using light signals coming from different points on, say, the meter stick. The meter stick in vacuum can move with acceleration, any arbitrary slower than light way. However, Alice's and Bob's movements, with their detectors, their photon detectors, must have no acceleration whatsoever, no g-force. In fact, Alice and Bob, strictly speaking, must be weightless, totally weightless, no gravity at all. In gravity-free space, outer space, to a good approximation, they each move in straight lines, weightless, no local proper acceleration. And this is not very well understood at all by many people who should know better. The picture on the right is the basic vacuum, what's called conformally invariant vacuum. If there's gravity, it only applies to the Weyl tensor, conformally invariant Weyl tensor vacuum part of the full Riemann-Christoffel curvature tensor in general relativity. And we have here, this is the light cone from the point of view of the observer or the detector. Is at the that point, that vertex point where the two cones meet, with time in the vertical direction and space in the horizontal plane direction. And the important point is that this structure is invariant, doesn't change from the points of view of both Alice and Bob, who are moving relative to each other, with Einstein called that uniformly, no accelerations. The detectors must not accelerate. What they're looking at can accelerate. So it's very important to get this straight. Inertial frame invariance of the vacuum speed of light. Einstein then showed that the coordinate vacuum speed of light, called little c, is invariant. That is the same number for both Alice and Bob, independent of their relative constant velocities, little v. In other words, Alice and Bob cannot be experiencing any g-force. So strictly speaking, for example, if Alice and Bob are fixed to the surface of the Earth, they feel weight. They are actually not in inertial frames. They are in what are called local non-inertial frames. And in that case, strictly speaking, special relativity does not hold. There have to be general relativity corrections, but these corrections are usually very small in practice, so they are ignored and not properly taught in almost every, at least every physics course in America, say in the 1950s, 1960s, that used, say, Halliday and Resnick as the physics book. And incompetent physics teachers continue to confuse the restricted inertial frame invariance of the vacuum coordinate speed of light, little c, with the homogeneity, isotropy, and non-dynamical changes of the static that doesn't change in time as the universe expands, of its numerical value, roughly 300 million meters per second in vacuum, and that it's also the same in different directions of our observable universe. So as soon as you hear some pundit say that the speed of light is constant, use your delete button. Do the same if you hear someone say that UFOs use inertial mass reduction, although explaining that will take some time. And here, just to review the foundation of the special relativity, Albert Einstein's theory of special relativity is built on two postulates. The principle of relativity, or actually the principle of special relativity, that the laws of physics are the same for all observers in all inertial, that is, non-accelerating reference frames, and invariance of the vacuum speed of light only in vacuum, not in material. Material is not true anymore. The invariance of the speed of light in a vacuum, little c, is the same for all inertial observers, regardless of their, actually what I call time-like geodesic motions, in the motion of, or independent of the motion of the light source. Doesn't matter, in vacuum. Okay, this is a tricky concept. There's what's called Fresnel drag and things like that, Sagnac effect, and we don't have time to get into that at this moment. Indeed, James Clerk Maxwell in Scotland around 1865 unified light, the little c in the equation below, electricity, the little epsilon zero, the first factor in the denominator on the right-hand side of the equation, and magnetism, the mu zero, what's called the magnetic permeability of the vacuum, which is the second little factor on the right-hand side of the equation. And that first factor I should have said is the electric permittivity of the vacuum, where these three numbers, the electric permittivity of the vacuum, the magnetic permeability of the vacuum, were measured independently by Faraday, Ampere, and others in the early 19th century. Basically, the vacuum, the electric permittivity of the vacuum has to do with the what's called the electric dipole moment of the virtual electron-positron plasma that's inside the quantum vacuum. Of course, Einstein didn't know this, and certainly Maxwell, they didn't know any of this back in the 19th century. This only became clear really around 1947, around the same time, actually, as the Roswell. That's interesting. It's interesting that Richard Feynman did his main papers on all this stuff around the same time of the Roswell crash. That may or may not tie in with what Eric Weinstein's been saying. I never thought of that before. It also ties in with what Phil Corso was saying. It'd be funny if Feynman got some of his great insights from the Roswell crash, but I'm just that's highly speculating. I'm not seriously saying that, but it's something we have to keep in mind. In any case, unknown to Einstein, in 1915, when he introduced his gravity field equations of general relativity, 10 years after the special relativity, we now know from Schwinger, Tominaga, and Feynman's Quantum Electrodynamics, 1947, again, same as Roswell crash, and creation of the CIA by Alan Dulles and James Jesus Angleton, and the rest of those guys, that the vacuum speed of light is a contingent dynamical physical process that depends upon the structure of the virtual electromagnetic plasma inside what Dirac called the Dirac sea. Now, there are also small corrections from the virtual particles of other species, but the dominant contribution by far is simply the virtual electron-positron plasma, and that's because the charge to mass ratio, the gyroscopic parameter of the electron, is the largest of all the massive elementary particles that we know of, and you can't include neutrinos because they don't have any electric charge, although they have weak charge. So that's another issue. So there we are, and also you should see a book by Sir Martin Rees called "Just Six Numbers." Explains how the quantum vacuum, is a contingent structure. So that means that although the vacuum speed of light is always going to be invariant for Alice and Bob moving in the vacuum along non-accelerating time-like geodesics, they'll always see the same vacuum speed of light. But what they see, that number may not be 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second. Somewhere else in the universe at a different time, it could be a different number and still be invariant. See, it's not, that's why to use the word constant for the vacuum speed of light is no good. It's too vague. It's sloppy thinking, because what they're really thinking of is that the vacuum speed of light has to be homogeneous, has to be the same number everywhere in the universe. That need not be the case. It may be the case, but it need not be the case. It's a purely empirical, not a fundamental issue. And that's the main point that a lot of physicists do not understand. Now, we saw in the previous slides that Einstein's principle of special relativity is that the laws of physics must be themselves invariant, of the same mathematical structure, the same form. All the equations, those are called tensor and spinor equations, they must be the same for all inertial frame observers. That is, Alice and Bob are each moving in vacuum. It's got to be in vacuum on what are called zero g-force time-like geodesics, without any g-force and without any what's called local proper acceleration, which is measured by the little accelerometer in your smartphone, in your iPhone. Okay. It can measure that thing, and that's also what's used in inertial navigation in ballistic missiles, the hypersonic missiles, and all that stuff. the ICBMs, unfortunately. So that's the point now. But now, what happens if the detector, if Alice and Bob are accelerating? What if they're on what are called off-time-like geodesic world lines in the four-dimensional space-time continuum? So what happens then? Those are called non-inertial frames, and there are corrections. But nevertheless, 10 years later, in 1915, after Einstein did his special principle of relativity, he extended his idea, very naturally, to the general principle of relativity, that all the laws of physics must have the same invariant mathematical, or this is actually covariant, of the same algebraic forms, even when the observers, the detectors, Alice and Bob, they could be rotating, they could be accelerating, they could be out in space firing their rockets, so that means that the equations of physics at the fundamental level must be formulated in terms of what is called tensor calculus and spinor calculus. It's a particular kind of mathematics that satisfies the two principles now, the principle of special relativity, in which Alice and Bob cannot move with any kind of g-force, and general relativity, in which Alice and Bob can move arbitrarily. They still can't move faster than light. They always have to move slower than light. All right. And an example of that, now it turns out the vacuum coordinate speed of light, little c, is not invariant under transformations between, say, an inertial frame to a non-inertial frame, or for transformations between two non-inertial frames. In other words, if Alice is not accelerating and Bob is accelerating, when they want to compare their data, when they're both looking at the same external events but they're both detecting, they're looking using photons in vacuum. They have to be moving in vacuum, coming from the object, say the UFO. They're both looking at a UFO, okay? In that case, the speed of light is not the same for them. And a good example of that is what's called the Sagnac effect, in which you just have like a rotating, like a phonograph record. You have a phonograph record, and if a little photon detector is clamped to the rotating phonograph record, the speed of light measured at different points on the rotating phonograph record will not be the same. It'll change, and that's called the Sagnac effect. So, and now getting back to this other thing, the contingent structure of the Dirac vacuum. This is a technical point, and I think I'll gloss over this point, except to say that there's something called, something called the Schwinger effect, which is now done with these very high power short pulse lasers. And guess what, guys? The Schwinger effect destroys classical relativity. Because classical relativity, remember I said classical relativity of Einstein, both special and general, by the way, only works in a vacuum. I left out something. The vacuum has to have a special property in order for classical relativity to work. In other words, every physics theory has what's called the limited domain of validity. Einstein's classical theories, both of general relativity, special relativity without gravity, and general relativity with gravity, they have a limited domain of validity, and they do not work if you hit the vacuum very hard with a high power laser in a very short pulse. They don't work, because what happens then, you get the Schwinger effect, in which there's so much so much voltage, so to speak, in the laser pulse that it pulls a virtual electron-positron pair out of the vacuum. It creates electron-positron pairs out of the vacuum, real electron-positron pairs. And that means that the phase speed, the wave speed of light in vacuum then depends on its frequency at that high level. And in that case, everything falls apart, and one has to be very, very careful because there could be unknown phenomena, maybe dangerous phenomena that happen in that case. So this is just to show the limits of Einstein's classical theory from the quantum mechanical Schwinger effect. Now we come to the key part of UFO or UAP, electrogravitic metric engineering physics. This is something that I'm pretty sure the engineers and physicists at Lockheed Martin, at Grumman, or any of the black projects, they don't understand anything of what I'm about to say. Now, I could be wrong, but we'll see. But this is something that even a lot of physicists don't understand. And this is why everything about the UAPs seems so strange, because they don't understand the basic physics. Relativity inside condensed matter does not work at low energies. It works at high energies, well, as long as they're not too high, of course. It works in the intermediate. You'll see below precisely. Again, to repeat from the last slide, relativity would not work if the classical vacuum at low energy had electromagnetic dispersion. That is, if the far field transverse polarized electromagnetic wave phase speed depended on its frequency. This is, we're assuming that photons have zero rest mass. So photons in what's called the geometrical optics limit, they always move on what in Einstein's classical theory, the geometrical optics limit, they move on null geodesics. Null geodesics means that there's zero proper time. Time stands still for any kind of consciousness that's light-like. In fact, such a consciousness could not exist, but that's another issue. In fact, this is the case for very strong electromagnetic waves from high-powered lasers at very short pulses, the Schwinger effect. But let's continue now. Condensed matter physicists know this tacitly for the emergent, coarse-grained, long-wave, low-frequency. That means low energy, effective field quasi-particles, and collective modes confined to the interior of the interacting many-particle system. The condition for relativity to work inside condensed matter is that the interaction energy between the bare particles is small compared to the internal energies of the relevant dynamical processes inside the bare particles. That is, the complex system must be an ideal gas to a good approximation. Now, I think this is pretty new to most of you pundits. You don't understand these things very well. Why UAP, inertial mass reduction, U.S. Navy, Salvatore Pais patent is bad, bogus physics. Of course, the microscopic vacuum relativity corrections continue to hold at shorter wavelengths and higher frequencies up to a point. That is, the binding energies of electrons and atoms and nucleons and nuclear matter still obey special relativities E equals mc squared, where m, of course, the inertial mass. That's very important. Remember, there are three kinds of mass in physics. There is the inertial mass, which is Newton's second law, the resistance, how much force you need to get a certain acceleration. That's called inertial mass. There's called the passive gravity mass, which is how a test particle responds to an external gravitational field. By a test particle, it means it has passive receptive mass, but it has zero effective active mass. The active mass is what creates a gravity field. So that when in the equivalence principle, that only applies to test particles, which only have effective passive mass. That is, you can ignore the self-gravity from their actual active mass. You can ignore that relative to the external source mass creating the external gravity field. That's the domain of validity of the equivalence principle. Again, that a lot of people don't understand, who should understand, but they don't. Okay. Now the condition. Then there's also the active mass, which I said, which is the self-gravity of the particle, and that's generally ignored in almost all the textbook examples of the applications of general relativity theory, and that's another point. The self-gravity is not well understood, and of course the whole point of the UFOs, these are all internal self-gravity effects, in which you have to be very careful even how to apply relativity. So people, they're totally clueless, the so-called pundits, in my opinion, totally clueless as to what's really going on. Okay, let me continue. The condition for the use of Einstein's E equals mc squared inside matter is that the interaction energy between the bare particles is small compared to the binding energy of the isolated systems. This is indeed the case, for example, in the nuclear fission bomb, was it Fat Boy, used in Hiroshima, in which the inertial mass reduction of 0.7 grams, less than 1 gram, out of a total like 64 kilograms of the bomb itself, of the fissionable material in the bomb. So this is a very tiny fraction released in about a microsecond, produced more than 10,000 tons of TNT. This is why any claim by crackpots that UFOs reduce their inertial mass to zero is idiotic rubbish. I repeat, it's idiotic rubbish. Throw those bums off the stage if you hear them say that. Furthermore, even if that happened, it would not explain the motion of UFOs. Any object with zero inertial mass in the geometric optics particle limit of small wave diffraction moves along a null geodesic. That's along the light cone that I showed before. In addition, a zero inertial mass electrically charged particle is not possible because the electric charge itself creates inertial mass. Now, I'm just a quick quote from Elon Musk's Super Grok, which says, Jack Sarfatti's text provides a concise and provocative overview of how special and general relativity interface with quantum electrodynamics, QED, and condensed matter physics, while sharply critiquing pseudoscientific claims about UFO propulsion. As a physicist known for his work on extensions to general relativity involving torsion fields and potential applications to advanced propulsion, Sarfatti draws on established principles to argue against simplistic ideas like zero inertial mass. I'll break down the key points and offer commentary highlighting accuracies, nuances, and implications. And at this point, I'm going to stop this particular APEC presentation. I include, you could get it offline, the rest of what Elon Musk Super Grok says about this issue, and this is a good point to stop and to get into more details on how the UFOs actually work in a separate lecture. We can't do, even God needed 6 days to create the universe, and I can't do everything that should be done in the space of 1 hour. I may have also already gone over the hour.